The door to room 217 stood slightly ajar, a sliver of yellow light cutting through the darkness of the motel corridor. Miranda Chen's hand trembled as she pressed her palm against the cheap wood, her wedding ring catching the fluorescent glow from the buzzing hallway fixture above. She could hear voices inside, one she recognized immediately as her husband's, low and urgent. The other voice made her blood run cold. It was a woman's, but it carried a strange, desperate edge that didn't match any affair she'd imagined. When she pushed the door open, the scene that greeted her wasn't a romantic betrayal. Her husband, David, stood in the center of the room, his white dress shirt spattered with something dark and wet. A woman lay motionless on the bed, her arm dangling off the edge, fingers grazing the stained carpet. David's eyes met Miranda's, and in that instant, she saw something she'd never seen before in their 12 years of marriage, pure, undiluted terror. "Miranda," he whispered, his voice breaking. "You weren't supposed to be here." Those were the last words she would hear him speak freely. Miranda Chen was born on March 15, 1985, in Portland, Oregon, to second-generation Chinese-American parents who ran a small herbal medicine shop in the Pearl District. She grew up surrounded by the scent of dried ginseng and the sound of her mother's mortar and pestle grinding remedies for neighborhood regulars. From an early age, Miranda learned that observation was a form of care. Watching someone's pallor, the way they held their shoulders, the tremor in their hands could reveal truths they wouldn't speak aloud. She met David Lawson during her sophomore year at Oregon State University, where she studied psychology and he pursued a degree in business administration. David was born December 3, 1983, in Boise, Idaho, the only child of a Methodist minister and a high school English teacher. He carried himself with a quiet confidence that Miranda found magnetic, a steadiness that seemed to promise security and predictability in a world she found increasingly chaotic. They married in 2013, a small ceremony at the Japanese Garden in Portland, and settled into what appeared to be an unremarkably happy marriage. David worked his way up to regional manager at a logistics company, while Miranda became a licensed therapist specializing in trauma and grief counseling. They lived in a modest craftsman house in the Selwood neighborhood, with a vegetable garden Miranda tended religiously and a garage workshop where David restored vintage motorcycles on weekends. But beneath the surface of their comfortable life, hairline fractures had begun to form. Miranda had always possessed an almost pathological need to understand, to excavate the truth from beneath layers of social nicety and polite evasion. It was what made her an exceptional therapist, but it also meant she noticed things most spouses would overlook. The way David's shower schedule had shifted, how he'd started keeping his phone face down on every surface, the new cologne that smelled nothing like the woodsy scent he'd worn for years. David, for his part, had grown up in a household where secrets were currency and appearances were everything. His father had preached forgiveness every Sunday while harboring a gambling addiction that nearly bankrupted the family. His mother smiled at church functions while prescription pills rattled in her purse. David learned early that the truth was something you rationed carefully, revealing only what was necessary to maintain peace. In recent months, Miranda had felt David slipping away from her in ways she couldn't articulate. He was physically present, still came home for dinner, still kissed her goodbye in the mornings, but emotionally, he'd erected walls she couldn't scale. When she'd ask what was troubling him, he'd smile and say, "Just work stress, babe. Nothing to worry about." But Miranda was worried. She'd made a career of recognizing its subtle manifestations. And what she saw in David wasn't the stress of quarterly reports or difficult clients. It was fear. The night of April 12, 2024, began like any other Friday. David had texted her at 6:47 p.m., working late. "Don't wait up." Miranda had stared at those words for a full minute, something cold settling in her chest. She'd heard that exact phrase 17 times in the past 2 months. Each time, she'd told herself she was being paranoid, that her professional training was making her see pathology where there was only banality. But tonight, something shifted. Maybe it was the full moon hanging low over Portland's skyline, or maybe it was simply that she'd reached the limit of her tolerance for uncertainty. She made a decision that would alter the trajectory of her life irrevocably. She would follow him. To understand what drove Miranda to that motel, you have to understand the architecture of her inner world, a structure built on the foundation of her parents' unspoken grief. Miranda's mother, Li Hua, had lost a child before Miranda was born. A son, stillborn at 8 months, never named because Chinese superstition suggested naming a baby before birth invited bad fortune. Li Hua never spoke of this loss directly, but it haunted their household like a ghost that rearranged furniture when no one was looking. Miranda grew up feeling the weight of that absent sibling, sensing that her mother was always partially elsewhere, always searching for someone who wasn't there. This created in Miranda a deep-seated fear of the unknown, of gaps in narrative, of unanswered questions. She learned to read her mother's moods by the way she handled herbs, grinding them with particular violence on bad days, or the way she'd stare out the shop window for hours, watching people pass by, looking for a face that would never appear. Miranda became a detective of emotion, piecing together stories from fragments and silences. David's background was equally formative, though in opposite ways. His father, Reverend Thomas Lawson, was beloved in their Boise congregation. A man who could make scripture sing, who visited the sick and buried the dead with equal compassion. But at home, Thomas was a different person entirely. The gambling started small, lottery tickets, office pools, but metastasized into something that consumed him. By the time David was 14, his father had embezzled $47,000 from the church building fund, a fact that never became public because Thomas's brother, a successful attorney, paid it back quietly. David watched his mother, Helen, perform elaborate emotional gymnastics to maintain their family's facade. She taught Sunday school while her marriage crumbled, smiled at potlucks while her medicine cabinet filled with Xanax and Ambien. She taught David that survival sometimes required careful curation of truth, that certain realities were too ugly to expose to light. When David met Miranda, he was drawn to her transparency, her insistence on excavating emotional truth. But he was also terrified of it. He loved her deeply, but part of him remained convinced that if she ever truly saw him, saw the inherited shame, the learned duplicity, the fear that he was fundamentally damaged, she would leave. Their marriage had been largely happy for the first decade. They were good partners, splitting household duties equitably, supporting each other's careers, planning modest vacations to coastal towns where they'd walk beaches and eat overpriced seafood. They'd tried for children for 3 years before accepting that Miranda's endometriosis made conception unlikely. This shared grief had, paradoxically, brought them closer. They'd mourned together, held each other through fertility treatments that failed, and ultimately decided that their life together was enough. But in January 2024, everything changed. David's company promoted him to a position that required frequent travel to Seattle for meetings with a major client. On his third trip, he witnessed something that shattered his carefully maintained equilibrium. His boss, Richard Moss, accepted an envelope of cash from the client's CFO in exchange for falsified inspection reports on shipping containers. David had stumbled into the hotel bar at the wrong moment, seen the exchange, understood immediately what it meant. Richard noticed him noticing. And Richard was not a man who left loose ends. What followed was a nightmare of coercion and entrapment. Richard pulled David into the scheme, manufacturing evidence that David had been involved from the start. Emails with doctored timestamps, expense reports with suspicious entries, a paper trail that suggested David was not just complicit but instrumental. Richard explained, with almost paternal patience, that if David exposed the operation, he'd go down with the ship, lose his job, face federal charges, destroy his marriage and reputation. David had 2 choices. Become an active participant or be framed as the architect of the entire conspiracy. He chose to participate, telling himself he'd find a way out, that he'd gather evidence and go to the authorities once he had proof of Richard's manipulation. But the deeper he waded into the corruption, the harder it became to see a path back to shore. The money was good, envelopes of cash that David hid in his motorcycle workshop, telling himself he'd return it once he'd figured out an exit strategy. The lies multiplied, each one requiring 3 more to sustain it. Miranda, with her therapist's intuition, sensed the change in him. But she misread the signs. She thought, affair. It was the obvious answer, the one that fit the evidence: late nights, secretiveness, emotional distance. She never imagined that her husband had become entangled in corporate fraud, that the woman whose name kept appearing in his text messages wasn't a mistress but Richard's assistant, Elena Voss, who was also trapped in the scheme. Elena was 32, born in Brooklyn to Russian émigré parents, a woman who'd put herself through community college while working 3 jobs. She'd landed the assistant position at David's company thinking it was her ticket to stability. Instead, she discovered she was working for a criminal who had no qualms about destroying anyone who threatened his operation. Elena had tried to get out in March. She'd gone to Richard and said she couldn't do this anymore, that her conscience was killing her. Richard had smiled his cold smile and showed her photographs. Images he'd had doctored to suggest she was having an affair with David, images that he'd sent to her fiancé, a jealous man with a violent temper, unless she continued to cooperate. So Elena stayed. And she and David formed a desperate alliance, 2 people caught in the same trap, trying to figure out how to escape without destroying their lives. The motel was where they met, neutral ground, away from the office, away from anywhere they might be recognized. They'd been planning their exit strategy, gathering evidence, building a case they could take to federal investigators once they had enough proof to protect themselves from Richard's retaliation. They had no idea Richard already knew. That he'd been watching them. That he'd decided they were too much of a risk. And they had no idea that Miranda had decided, on this particular Friday night, that she'd had enough of uncertainty. That she was going to follow her husband and finally confront whatever truth he'd been hiding. Miranda sat in her Honda Civic 3 cars behind David's Subaru, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles had gone white. The spring rain had started as a mist but now fell in sheets, blurring the taillights ahead into crimson smears against the wet pavement. She'd never followed anyone before, not like this, not with intention. And the act itself felt transgressive, a violation of some unspoken marital covenant. David's behavior in recent weeks had moved beyond suspicious into actively disturbing. 2 nights ago, she'd woken at 3 a.m. to find his side of the bed empty. She'd found him in the garage, sitting in the darkness among his motorcycle parts, staring at nothing. When she'd touched his shoulder, he'd flinched violently, then tried to laugh it off. Bad dream, he'd said, but his eyes had been wide open, tracking something in the shadows she couldn't see. Yesterday, she'd noticed his hands shaking as he poured his morning coffee. He'd spilled it, cursed with unusual vehemence, then apologized profusely when he saw her watching. "I'm fine," he'd insisted, but he wasn't fine. She could see the telltale signs she'd been trained to recognize in her clients. The hypervigilance, the startle response, the way he seemed to be bracing for impact from an invisible threat. She'd tried to talk to him. Over dinner on Wednesday, she'd reached across the table and taken his hand. "David, whatever's happening, we can handle it together. But I need you to tell me the truth." He'd looked at her then with such profound sadness that it had taken her breath away. For a moment, she thought he might actually tell her. His mouth had opened, words forming somewhere in his throat. Then his phone buzzed. He'd glanced at the screen, and whatever moment they'd been sharing shattered like dropped glass. "I have to take this," he'd said, and disappeared into his workshop for 45 minutes. When he emerged, the walls were back up, his face carefully neutral. Now, watching his car turn off the interstate toward a part of Portland neither of them had reason to visit. An area of budget motels and industrial warehouses near the river, Miranda felt her heart hammering against her ribs. This wasn't the direction to his office. This wasn't the neighborhood of any friend she knew. The Riverside Motor Lodge was exactly the kind of establishment where people went when they didn't want to be found. Its neon sign flickered epileptically, half the letters burned out, spelling out something that might have been RVRDE in acid green. David's Subaru pulled into the parking lot, navigating around potholes filled with oily rainwater. Miranda continued past, parking on the street where she had a clear view of the entrance. She watched David emerge from his car, collar turned up against the rain, and walk quickly toward the office. He moved like a man trying to be invisible, shoulders hunched, head down. There was none of his usual easy confidence, the way he typically carried himself through the world with quiet assurance. Minutes passed. The rain intensified. Miranda's windows began to fog from her breathing, and she wiped the glass with her sleeve, not wanting to lose sight of him. She checked her phone, 7:23 p.m. No messages. David had stopped texting her updates hours ago, which was itself unusual. For all his recent distance, he'd maintained the small rituals of their relationship, the good morning texts, the check-ins during the day, the "I love you" before bed. Then she saw him again, emerging from the office with a key in hand. He walked past his car toward the row of ground-floor rooms, stopping at a door marked 217. He knocked, 3 sharp raps, and the door opened immediately. Miranda strained to see who was inside, but the angle was wrong and the rain obscured her view. David disappeared into the room. The door closed. Miranda sat in her car, engine running, heater on, trying to decide what to do. Every rational bone in her body told her to leave, to turn around and go home, to confront David tomorrow in the safety of daylight and their shared home. But the therapist in her, the part that had spent years helping clients work through deception and betrayal, needed to see. Needed to know. Couldn't tolerate another night of uncertainty. She'd spent 12 years building a life with this man. She'd negotiated fertility treatments with him, buried her father beside him, planned their future in late-night conversations where they dreamed aloud about growing old together. She deserved to know who he'd become. Miranda killed the engine, pulled up her hood, and stepped out into the rain. The parking lot was nearly empty, a few cars that looked like they'd been abandoned weeks ago, a pickup truck with one flat tire, a motorcycle covered by a blue tarp. Security lights cast sickly yellow pools across the pavement. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked incessantly, the sound echoing off concrete and metal. As she walked toward room 217, Miranda noticed things her subconscious registered as wrong. The curtain in room 215 twitching closed as she passed, the smell of cigarette smoke and something chemical she couldn't identify, the way the silence felt heavy despite the rain's white noise. She reached the door. Up close, she could hear voices inside. David's, urgent and low, and a woman's voice, higher-pitched, strained. They weren't laughing. They weren't engaged in anything intimate. They were arguing. "Can't keep doing this," the woman was saying. "He knows. I'm telling you, Richard knows." "We're so close," David replied. "One more week and we'll have everything we need." "We don't have a week." "He's going to." Miranda's hand moved before her brain could stop it. She knocked on the door, the same 3 sharp raps David had used. The voices inside went instantly silent. For what felt like an eternity, nothing happened. Miranda stood in the rain, water running down her face, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Then the door opened a crack, and David's face appeared in the gap. When he saw her, all color drained from his features. "Miranda," he said, and in that single word, she heard everything, shock, horror, and something that sounded terrifyingly like finality. "Who are you meeting?" Miranda asked, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "Who's in there with you?" David glanced behind him, then back at her. She saw him making rapid calculations, weighing options, all the careful control he usually maintained completely absent from his face. "You need to leave," he said quietly. "Right now. Please, Miranda. Just get in your car and go home. I'm not going anywhere until you tell me what's happening. Miranda, please." She pushed past him into the room. The scene Miranda walked into made no sense for several critical seconds. Her brain struggled to reconcile what she was seeing with what she'd expected to find. A woman, young, blonde, wearing a business suit, sat on the edge of the motel bed, her face in her hands, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The bed itself was covered in papers, bank statements, shipping manifests, photographs of what looked like warehouse interiors. A laptop sat open on the desk, its screen showing a spreadsheet filled with numbers and dates. Nothing about this suggested an affair. David closed the door behind Miranda, his face now completely blank, the expression she recognized from when he was trying to manage a difficult situation, trying to think 3 moves ahead. "This is Elena," he said, his voice hollow. "She's a colleague." Elena looked up, her face tear-streaked and exhausted. She appeared to be in her early 30s, with dark circles under her eyes and the wired, frantic energy of someone who hadn't slept in days. When she saw Miranda, something like despair crossed her features. "Oh God," Elena whispered. "David, what is she doing here?" "I followed him," Miranda said, still trying to process the scene. "I thought," she stopped, because what she'd thought suddenly seemed absurd given the evidence before her. "What is all this?" David moved to stand between Miranda and the papers on the bed, a defensive gesture that immediately raised her suspicions. "It's work," he said. "Just work stuff. Boring logistics paperwork. Elena and I were reviewing quarterly reports." "Don't lie to her." Elena's voice cracked as she stood abruptly, papers scattering to the floor. "Jesus Christ, David, we're past lying." She turned to Miranda, her eyes wild. "Your husband and I have been documenting a massive fraud scheme at our company. Our boss has been accepting bribes to falsify shipping inspection reports, and we've been gathering evidence to take to the FBI. But now he knows we know, and—" She stopped mid-sentence, her face going suddenly pale. Her hand moved to her side, pressing against her ribs. "I don't feel right," she said faintly. "I feel—" Elena stumbled, her legs giving out. David lunged forward, catching her before she hit the floor. "Elena? Elena, what's wrong?" But Miranda had already seen it, the woman's lips were turning blue. Her breathing had become shallow and rapid. These were signs Miranda recognized from her crisis intervention training, signs of respiratory distress, possible poisoning or overdose. "Call 911. Miranda shouted, dropping to her knees beside them. She checked Elena's pulse, rapid and thready. When did she start feeling sick? What did she take? Nothing. She didn't take anything. David's hands were shaking as he lowered Elena to the floor. "We ordered coffee from the diner next door, but that was over an hour ago. She was fine until—" Elena's body convulsed once, violently, then went terrifyingly still. Miranda began CPR immediately, tilting Elena's head back, checking for obstruction, starting chest compressions while David fumbled for his phone. But even as she worked, counting compressions, breathing into Elena's mouth, she knew. She'd volunteered at a crisis center for 3 years, she'd seen this before. The blue lips, the sudden collapse, the rapid onset, this was poison, something fast-acting and lethal. "They're saying 12 minutes for an ambulance," David said, his voice breaking. "Miranda, she's not breathing." "Keep trying to get through," Miranda commanded, continuing compressions even though Elena's pupils had blown wide, even though her skin had taken on a waxy pallor that meant death was seconds away, not minutes. Elena's eyes fluttered open one last time. She looked directly at Miranda, her lips moving, trying to form words. Miranda leaned close, ear next to Elena's mouth, still maintaining chest compressions. "Richard," Elena breathed, so faint Miranda almost missed it. "Richie, coffee," he knew. Then nothing. The body beneath Miranda's hands went completely limp, all resistance gone. Miranda continued compressions for another minute, but she already knew. She'd lost her. David was on the phone with 911, giving their location, his voice mechanical, but Miranda wasn't listening. She sat back on her heels, staring at the dead woman on the floor, trying to process what had just happened. The coffee. Someone had poisoned the coffee. Miranda's head snapped up, her eyes finding the two styrofoam cups on the desk. One was empty. The other was still half full. "David," she said slowly. "Did you drink the coffee?" He looked at her blankly, still holding the phone. "What?" "The coffee. Did you drink yours?" He gestured vaguely toward the desk. "No, I don't like coffee from that diner. Too weak. I just got a Coke from the vending machine." Miranda stood, moving carefully toward the desk. She could smell it now, beneath the coffee's bitter scent, something else. Almonds. Bitter almonds. Cyanide. "We need to leave," she said quietly. "Right now. David, we need to leave this room immediately." "What?" "No, we have to wait for the ambulance. Whoever killed her might still be here. Whoever poisoned that coffee could be watching right now to make sure it worked." Miranda grabbed David's arm, pulling him toward the door. "We leave now, we meet the paramedics outside." The lights went out. 1 second the room was bathed in the cheap motel's fluorescent glow, the next they were plunged into absolute darkness. The only light came from David's phone screen, casting their faces in ghostly blue. "Breaker box," David whispered. Someone cut the power. From outside came the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving across the parking lot toward their door. Not the hurried steps of a paramedic responding to an emergency. These were patient, measured, the walk of someone who had all the time in the world. Miranda's mind, trained in crisis response, kicked into gear. She grabbed the laptop from the desk, shoving it into David's hands. "The evidence," she hissed. "Whatever you've collected, we can't let them destroy it." The doorknob rattled. David moved fast, scooping papers from the bed, stuffing them inside his jacket. Miranda grabbed the external hard drive she'd spotted connected to the laptop. Then David took her hand, she felt his wedding ring press against her palm, and pulled her toward the bathroom window. Behind them, they heard the sound of a key sliding into the lock. Not someone breaking in. Someone with authorized access. Someone who could walk into any room in this motel whenever they pleased. The bathroom window was small, but Miranda was slender enough to fit through. David boosted her up, and she scrambled through into the rain-soaked night, landing in mud and gravel behind the building. David came through seconds later, and together they ran, not toward their cars, which sat in full view of the motel office, but toward the line of trees beyond the parking lot. As they ran, Miranda heard the door to room 217 open. She risked a glance back and saw a figure silhouetted in the doorway, backlit by the emergency lights in the hallway. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, scanning the parking lot with methodical precision. He pulled out a phone, lifted it to his ear, and spoke words Miranda couldn't hear over her ragged breathing and the blood pounding in her ears. Then he turned and looked directly at where she and David crouched in the shadows. Even from this distance, even in the darkness, Miranda recognized the gesture that followed. The man pointed at them. Not an idle gesture, but a designation. A marking for death. David's grip on her hand tightened. "Run," he breathed. They ran. They drove through the night in Miranda's Honda, constantly checking mirrors, taking random turns, eventually ending up in a 24-hour diner in Gresham, 30 miles from the motel. David had insisted they leave his Subaru, they'll be tracking it, he'd said, and Miranda hadn't argued because by now, some fundamental shift had occurred in her understanding of reality. Her husband was involved in corporate fraud. A woman had just died in front of her, murdered. And someone had tried to kill them too. They sat in a back booth, untouched coffee growing cold between them, the laptop and papers spread across the table like evidence at a crime scene. Which, Miranda supposed, they were. "Tell me everything," Miranda said. Her voice was steady, but her hands shook as she wrapped them around her coffee mug. From the beginning. And David, no more lies. So he told her. All of it. The trip to Seattle, witnessing Richard's transaction, the blackmail, the manufactured evidence, the months of being trapped in an escalating nightmare. Elena's involvement. Their plan to gather proof and go to the FBI. Richard's growing paranoia. The increasing danger. I wanted to tell you, David said, his face haggard in the diner's fluorescent light. So many times, I almost did. But Richard made it clear that if I talked to anyone, he'd make sure I went down for everything. He has connections, Miranda. Law enforcement, judges, people I didn't even know existed. He showed me files on other people who tried to expose him. They're in prison now, convicted of crimes they didn't commit, or they're dead, ruled as suicides or accidents. Miranda listened, her therapist's mind organizing information even as her wife's heart broke for what her husband had endured alone. Why didn't you just quit? Walk away. He made that impossible. He had me sign documents I didn't understand, contracts that made me legally liable for shipments I'd never even seen. He forged my signature on inspection reports. By the time I realized what he'd done, I was in too deep. If I walked away, he'd release everything to the authorities and I'd be arrested within a week. So you and Elena decided to build a case against him. It was the only way out. We had to gather enough evidence that when we went to the FBI, they'd see Richard as the architect and us as witnesses, not accomplices. David's hands were shaking as he sorted through the papers. We've been at it for 3 months. Bank records showing the bribes. Photos of the falsified container inspections. Testimony from dock workers who were paid to look the other way. We were going to hand it all over next week, after we'd met with a lawyer Elena knew who specializes in whistleblower cases. But Richard found out. He must have been watching us this whole time. Listening, somehow. David's face went pale. Jesus. The coffee. He poisoned the coffee. That means he knew we'd be at that motel, knew when we'd be there, knew Elena would drink coffee. Miranda was already opening the laptop, fingers flying across the keyboard. Her psychology background hadn't included much tech training, but she'd worked with enough paranoid clients to know what to look for. Check your phone, she said. Look for any apps you don't recognize, anything that might be spyware. David pulled out his phone and began scrolling. Within seconds, his face went white. There's an app here I've never seen before. System updates but I never downloaded this. Richard installed it. Probably remotely, or he had someone do it when you weren't looking. He's been tracking your location, maybe even listening to your conversations. Miranda felt sick. This level of surveillance, the patience it required, the resources, Richard wasn't just covering up fraud. He was running a sophisticated criminal operation. She turned to the laptop, opening the files Elena and David had collected. What she saw made her breath catch. The fraud went back 7 years. Richard had been systematically accepting bribes from multiple shipping companies to falsify inspection reports on containers coming through the port of Portland. Some of those containers held legitimate goods. But others, Miranda's hands went cold as she clicked through photographs, held things that should never have made it past customs. Weapons. Drugs. In one photo, she saw what looked like trafficked individuals, huddled in a shipping container, barely visible in the shadows. Oh my God, Miranda whispered. David, this isn't just corporate fraud. Richard isn't just cooking the books. He's facilitating trafficking. Human trafficking. Gun running. This is organized crime, David finished, his voice hollow. I didn't know. I swear to God, Miranda, when this started, I thought it was just financial fraud. Bribery, falsified paperwork, the kind of white-collar stuff that gets you prison time but not this. Miranda kept clicking through files, her horror mounting. Bank transfers in the millions. Names of shell companies. Photographs of Richard meeting with men whose faces were familiar from news reports, known cartel members, arms dealers, human traffickers. And then she found the file labeled insurance. Inside were dossiers. Dozens of them. Complete backgrounds on everyone who worked in Richard's sphere, David and Elena, obviously, but also other employees, their families, their vulnerabilities. Miranda found her own file and felt bile rise in her throat. There were photographs of her at work, entering her therapy office, meeting clients. Notes about her daily routine. Her parents' address. Her sister is in California. Every person she loved, documented and mapped. One line in her file made her blood run cold, asterisk, primary leverage point for David Lawson. High emotional investment. Risk-averse personality. Likely to prioritize her safety over principle. Asterisk. He was always going to kill Elena, Miranda said slowly, realization dawning. Even if she'd stayed quiet, even if she'd kept cooperating. She knew too much. And eventually, he'll kill you too. And me. Because now I know. David reached across the table, taking both her hands in his. I'm so sorry. God, Miranda, I'm so sorry. I thought I was protecting you by keeping you out of it. I thought if I could just gather enough evidence, go to the FBI, we'd be safe and you'd never have to know any of this happened. We need to go to the police, Miranda said. Right now. Tonight. We bring them everything. We can't. David's voice was desperate. That's what Elena tried to tell you before she died. Richard has people in the police department. We don't know who we can trust. If we go to the wrong person, we end up dead or framed, and all this evidence disappears. Miranda sat back, her mind racing through options. As a therapist, she was trained in crisis intervention, but this was beyond anything she'd ever encountered. Think, she told herself. Use your training. What do people need to survive trauma? Safety first. Then documentation. Then trusted allies. The FBI, she said. We go straight to the FBI field office. Walk in with everything, demand to speak with the special agent in charge. We go first thing tomorrow when they open, we don't call ahead, we just show up so Richard can't intercept us. What if he has people there too? Then we make copies of everything and send them to journalists, to multiple FBI offices, to every authority we can think of. We make it impossible for him to contain this. Miranda was thinking out loud now, building a plan. But first, we need somewhere safe to spend the night. Somewhere he can't find us. David looked at his phone like it was a bomb. He's tracking this. We need to destroy it. Not yet. First, we download everything from it that might be useful, texts, call logs, anything that proves Richard's harassment or threats. Then we destroy it. Miranda pulled out her own phone. Mine too. He might have gotten to both of them. They spent the next hour systematically documenting everything, taking photos of the files on Elena's laptop, backing up data to a cloud drive Miranda set up with a new email account. They screenshot David's text messages with Richard, emails, anything that might serve as evidence. As they worked, Miranda found herself studying her husband's face. 12 years she'd been married to this man, and she'd thought she knew him. But the person sitting across from her now was both familiar and strange, her David, but also someone who'd been living in a nightmare she couldn't have imagined, making impossible choices in impossible circumstances. Why didn't you tell me? She asked quietly. Even after it got bad, even when you knew you were in danger, why keep me in the dark? David was silent for a long moment. Because, he finally said, my whole life, I watched my parents keep secrets. My dad's gambling, my mom's pills. They thought they were protecting each other, protecting me. But all those secrets did was poison everything. They destroyed my parents' marriage, destroyed their integrity. I swore I'd never do that to you. I'd never lie, never hide who I really was. And yet you did. And yet I did, he acknowledged, his voice breaking. Because when I was actually faced with the choice between protecting you and being honest with you, I chose what my parents chose. I chose the lie, thinking it was love. But it wasn't love. It was cowardice. And it almost got you killed tonight. Miranda reached across the table and took his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. We're going to survive this, she said. But from now on, no more secrets. No more protecting me from hard truths. We're partners. That means we face things together. David nodded, tears streaming down his face. Together, he repeated. They destroyed their phones in the diner's parking lot, smashing them with a tire iron from Miranda's trunk, then throwing the pieces into separate dumpsters. They paid for their coffee in cash, left no trail, and drove to the one place Miranda thought they might be safe, her childhood friend's cabin in the Columbia River Gorge, an hour east of Portland. Sarah was in Japan on business, but Miranda knew where the spare key was hidden. As they drove through the pre-dawn darkness, Miranda replayed the night's events. Elena's death. The poisoned coffee. The figure in the doorway. The files revealed the true scope of Richard's criminal enterprise. And she realized something that made her blood run cold. They'd left Elena's body in that motel room. Alone. No one to speak for her, no one to demand justice for her murder. We have to make sure this matters, Miranda said. Elena died trying to stop Richard. We have to finish what she started. David nodded, his hands tight on the steering wheel. We will, he promised. Or we'll die trying. Neither of them said aloud what they both knew, given what they'd seen, what they knew, dying was very much on the table. The cabin smelled of cedar and old smoke when they arrived, dawn breaking cold and gray over the gorge. Miranda had spent summers here as a child, swimming in the creek that ran behind the property, and the familiar scent triggered memories of simpler times, times when her biggest worry was whether she'd catch crawfish for dinner. That innocence felt impossibly distant now. They worked in focused silence, organizing the evidence into coherent categories. Miranda, with her therapist's eye for pattern recognition, began building a timeline of Richard's criminal operations. David, using his logistics background, mapped the flow of illegal shipments through the port. Together, they constructed a narrative that even the most skeptical federal agent couldn't dismiss. But as morning wore into afternoon, Miranda felt something shifting inside her. The shock and terror of the previous night was giving way to something colder, harder. She recognized this transformation from her work with trauma survivors, the moment when victimhood calcifies into purpose. She thought of Elena's last words. Richard. The way she'd said his name, not with fear, but with a kind of weary rage, as if she'd finally seen him clearly for what he was. Tell me about him, Miranda said, looking up from the laptop. Richard. What kind of man is he? David considered this. Charismatic. Everyone at the company loves him. He remembers birthdays, asks about people's kids, and sponsors the company's softball team. He's the guy who stays late to help with a difficult project, who brings donuts on Friday mornings. Classic narcissistic sociopath, Miranda murmured. Builds goodwill as camouflage, uses charm as a weapon. What's his background? Ex-military. Marines, I think. Served in Iraq during the war. Came back, got his business degree on the GI Bill, worked his way up through the logistics industry. David paused. He has a family. Wife, 2 kids. They live in Lake Oswego, nice house, very normal-looking life. Miranda thought about the insurance files, the meticulous documentation of vulnerabilities, the patient stalking. He's not going to stop, she said. Even if we go to the FBI, even if we hand over all this evidence, he'll see us as a permanent threat. He'll come after us, after our families, after anyone we care about. I know, David said quietly. So we have a choice to make. Miranda stood, walked to the cabin window. Outside, rain had started again, misting the evergreens that surrounded the property. We can run. Disappear. Change our names, leave the country, spend the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders. Or we fight, David finished. Miranda turned to face him. In the gray light filtering through the window, she could see how much the past months had aged him. But she could also see something else, resolve. Her husband had been living in fear for so long, paralyzed by impossible choices. Now, with everything out in the open, with nothing left to lose, he looked almost relieved. If we fight, there's a good chance we die, she said baldly. Richard has resources, connections, experience with violence. We're a therapist and a logistics manager. We're overmatched. But we have something he doesn't, David said. We have the truth. And we have each other. Miranda thought about the Stoic philosophers she'd studied in graduate school. Epictetus, who taught that freedom comes from accepting what you cannot control while acting with integrity on what you can. Marcus Aurelius, who wrote that the impediment to action advances action. That obstacles become the way forward. They couldn't control Richard's resources or his willingness to kill. But they could control their response. They could choose courage over comfort, justice over survival. The FBI office opens at 9 Monday morning, Miranda said. That gives us 36 hours to prepare. We need to make copies of everything, send packages to multiple locations, journalists, other FBI offices, the state attorney general. We create a dead man's switch. If anything happens to us, everything gets released automatically. Richard will know we're doing this. He'll move against us before Monday. Let him try. Miranda was surprised by the steel in her own voice. We'll be ready. They spent the rest of Saturday fortifying their position. Miranda, using her therapy training in crisis preparedness, created contingency plans for every scenario she could imagine. David, with his methodical nature, focused on evidence preservation, making multiple encrypted backups, establishing protocols for secure communication. By Saturday evening, they transformed from panicked fugitives into something more dangerous, witnesses with nothing left to lose and everything documented. As night fell, they sat on the cabin's porch, watching stars emerge between clouds. Miranda leaned against David's shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady rhythm of his breathing. Are you scared? She asked. Terrified, he admitted. But also, I don't know. Clearer than I've been in months. Does that make sense? It did. Miranda had seen this in her clients who'd survived trauma, the way crisis could strip away everything inessential, leaving only what truly mattered. Fear became simple fuel. Anger became a focused purpose. Love became something you die to protect. I love you, she said. I need you to know that. Whatever happens Monday, whatever comes next, I love you. Not despite what you did, not despite the choices you made. I love you including all of it. The mistakes, the fear, the courage it took to try to make things right. David turned to her, cupping her face in his hands. I've never deserved you, he said. From the day we met, I knew you were better than me. Braver, more honest, more willing to look at hard truths. I spent our whole marriage trying to be worthy of you. You already were, Miranda said. You just couldn't see it. They made love that night with a desperate intensity, knowing it might be the last time. After lying tangled in Sarah's guest bed, Miranda stared at the ceiling and thought about transformation. She'd spent her career helping people change, helping them move from victim to survivor, from broken to healing. But she'd always thought of change as a gradual process, something that unfolded over months or years through patient therapeutic work. Now she understood that sometimes transformation is instant. Sometimes you walk through a motel door and the person you were with dies, and someone new is born in the space between one heartbeat and the next. The Miranda who'd followed her husband out of jealous curiosity was gone. The woman who remained had watched someone die, had run for her life, had chosen to stand and fight against impossible odds. She wasn't sure she liked this new version of herself, this harder, colder person who could calculate risk with emotional detachment. But she recognized it was necessary. Survival required letting go of who you'd been and becoming who the situation demanded. Sunday passed in a blur of final preparations. They practiced their story until they could tell it smoothly, anticipating questions, preparing for skepticism. They made copies of copies, sent packages to dead drops, set up encrypted email accounts programmed to autosend if they didn't check in every 12 hours. By Sunday night, they were ready. As ready as two ordinary people could be to walk into a federal building and blow up a criminal empire. One more thing, Miranda said, opening the laptop one final time. She navigated to a folder she'd created, labeled simply, Miranda's Files. Inside were documents she'd been quietly compiling, character references from colleagues, letters from clients, with identifying information redacted, testifying to her integrity, her professional reputation, her commitment to truth. If she was going to die in this fight, she wanted to leave behind evidence that she'd mattered, that her life had purpose beyond this final desperate act. "What are you doing?" David asked. "Leaving a record," Miranda said. "So people know who we really were. Not just victims of Richard's crimes, but people with full lives, with values, with reasons to stand up when it would have been easier to run." She added a final document, a letter to her parents, telling them she loved them, explaining why she'd chosen this path, asking them to be proud rather than angry. Then she closed the laptop and turned to David. "We should get some sleep," she said. "Tomorrow's going to be a long day." But neither of them slept. They lay awake in the darkness, listening to rain on the cabin roof, holding each other, waiting for dawn and whatever would follow. Monday morning arrived overcast and cold. Miranda and David left the cabin at 7, allowing plenty of time for the drive to the FBI's Portland field office downtown. They discussed whether to call ahead, ultimately deciding that showing up unannounced was safer, harder for Richard to intercept if he didn't know they were coming. The drive down I-84 into Portland was tense. Every car that followed them for more than a few exits became suspect. Every pedestrian at red light seemed potentially threatening. Miranda had bought a burner phone Sunday afternoon, and she kept it in her lap, ready to call 911 if necessary. "He has to know we're coming," David said, his hands tight on the steering wheel. "He knows we have the evidence, knows we won't stop. He'll be planning something." "So we stay in public," Miranda replied, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. "We park in the most visible spot possible. We walk straight in the main entrance. We don't stop, don't talk to anyone except the FBI." They'd rehearsed this. Quick, efficient, no opportunities for interception. As they entered Portland proper, traffic thickened. Office workers commuting downtown, parents dropping kids at school, the Monday morning rhythm of a city waking up. It felt surreal to Miranda that the world was continuing normally while her life balanced on a knife's edge. They took the exit for downtown, navigating toward the FBI building. It was housed in a nondescript office tower in the Pearl District, the agency's presence marked only by subtle security features and a small placard beside the entrance. 3 blocks away, David suddenly tensed. "Silver Lexus," he said. 4 cars back. "That's Richard's car." Miranda twisted in her seat, trying to see through the morning traffic. "Are you sure? License plate XKV 492. I've seen it in the company parking garage 1,000 times." David's voice was tight. "He's following us. Keep driving. Don't speed up, don't slow down. Just get to the FBI building." But as they approached the next intersection, the Lexus suddenly accelerated, swerving through traffic, pulling alongside them. Miranda got a clear look at the driver. Richard Moss was exactly as David had described, handsome, late 40s, with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. He looked over at them, and even through two car windows and morning traffic, Miranda could see his expression, calm, controlled, absolutely confident. He smiled. Then he held up a phone, tapping it meaningfully before pointing ahead. Miranda followed his gesture and felt her heart drop. Half a block ahead, at the intersection leading to the FBI building, 3 police cars sat with lights flashing, officers directing traffic away from the street. "It's a setup," David breathed. "He's closed the road. We can't get to the FBI building." The light turned green. The Lexus pulled ahead, turning right toward an underground parking garage. Richard gestured for them to follow, a casual wave, as if inviting friends for coffee. "What do we do?" David asked. Miranda's mind raced. If they tried to go around the police barricade, they'd be stopped, questioned. Richard probably had officers on his payroll ready to arrest them on fabricated charges. If they ran, they'd be pursued, possibly killed in what would be ruled a justified shooting. But if they followed Richard into that parking garage, they'd be playing by his rules, on his territory. "We follow him," Miranda said. "What?" "He's giving us an audience. He wants to talk, probably wants to make some kind of deal or threat. But we're in public, there are security cameras, other people around. He can't just kill us in a parking garage without witnesses." "You don't know that." "No, I don't. But I know that running gets us killed for certain. This way, we have a chance." Miranda met David's eyes. "Trust me." David nodded slowly, then followed the Lexus down into the parking garage. The structure was mostly empty at this early hour. The office workers who parked here wouldn't arrive for another 30 minutes. Richard pulled into a spot in the lowest level, far from the entrance, beneath fluorescent lights that buzzed and flickered. David parked 3 spots away, leaving space between the cars. Richard got out of his vehicle slowly, straightening his suit jacket, adjusting his cuffs. He moved like a man with all the time in the world. When David and Miranda exited their car, Richard smiled that same confident smile. "Miranda," he said warmly, as if greeting an old friend. "I've been looking forward to meeting you. David talks about you constantly. Though I suspect he's been leaving out some of the more interesting details of his work lately." "Mr. Moss," Miranda said evenly. "I assume you know why we're here." "I have some idea. You've been collecting materials that don't belong to you, drawing some unfortunate conclusions, and you're planning to waste the FBI's time with wild conspiracy theories." Richard's tone was pleasant, almost amused. "I'm here to save you the embarrassment." "Elena Voss is dead," David said, his voice shaking. "You poisoned her. We watched her die." "That's a very serious accusation," Richard replied, his expression never changing. "I hope you have proof. Because without it, all you have is slander. And slander, David, has consequences." He pulled out his phone, tapped the screen, then turned it to face them. On the display was security footage. The motel parking lot, time-stamped Friday night. Miranda watched herself and David running from room 217, clearly visible, clearly fleeing a crime scene. "Do you know what the police will see when they review this footage?" Richard asked conversationally. "They'll see 2 people leaving the scene of a woman's death. Running away. Taking evidence with them. It looks very much like guilt." "Because you edited out yourself entering the room," Miranda said. "You controlled what the security cameras captured. Prove it." Richard's smile widened. "Go ahead. Tell the FBI your story. Explain how your husband has been involved in a fraud scheme for months. There's ample documentation of that, emails with his name on them, reports he signed. Explain how he and Elena were meeting in secret at motels. Tell them you followed your husband there, confronted them, and somehow, tragically, Elena ended up dead. Who do you think they'll believe? A respected businessman with military service and community ties? Or a desperate couple with every motive to cover up a crime? Miranda felt the trap closing around them. Richard had been planning this for months, building a narrative that cast David as the criminal and himself as the innocent victim. Every piece of evidence they'd collected could be reframed, reinterpreted through Richard's lens. What do you want? David asked quietly. Smart question. Richard pocketed his phone. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to give me every copy you've made of those files, the laptop, the hard drives, the cloud backups, everything. You're going to sign documents admitting that you fabricated evidence in an attempt to frame me for crimes I didn't commit. Then you're going to leave Portland. Today. Right now. You'll start new lives somewhere else, and you'll never speak of this again. And if we refuse? Miranda asked, though she already knew the answer. Then I make a phone call, and you're both arrested within the hour. David faces federal fraud charges. I have more than enough evidence to make those stick. You, Miranda, become an accessory after the fact. And while you're both in prison, unable to defend yourselves, tragic things might happen. Suicides are quite common in lockup, I understand. The shame, the pressure, very understandable. Richard checked his watch. You have 2 minutes to decide. After that, my offer expires, and I make that phone call. Miranda looked at David, then back at Richard. The parking garage felt tomb-like, concrete and shadows, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, the smell of oil and exhaust thick in the air. 2 minutes. Everything they'd fought for, everyone who'd suffered because of Richard's crimes, Elena, the trafficking victims in those shipping containers, every person who'd been destroyed by his network. All of it would disappear if they took his deal. But if they refused, they'd likely die. Either in prison or in some staged accident. Richard had too many resources, too much power. Show me, Miranda said suddenly. Richard raised an eyebrow. Show you what? Your phone. Show me that footage again. Let me see the timestamp, the angle of the camera. Richard hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but Miranda caught it. The therapist in her recognized that micro-expression, uncertainty. She'd hit something. Why would I? Because if you edited that footage, Miranda continued, her voice growing stronger, you had to have accessed the motel's security system. Which means you were controlling it in real time. Which means you were watching us, watching Elena die. And if you were watching, you were recording. The question is, where's that recording now? David caught on. Your phone, he said. You've been recording this entire conversation, haven't you? That's why you wanted to meet in person. You want us on video accepting your deal, admitting guilt, all of it nicely documented. Richard's smile faltered. But here's what you didn't count on, Miranda said, pulling out the burner phone from her pocket. We've been recording too. Every word you just said. The threats, the admission that you have fabricated evidence against David, the offer to let us go if we disappear, all of it is documented. She'd started the voice recorder app the moment they'd entered the parking garage, the phone's microphone sensitive enough to capture Richard's voice clearly. Richard's expression changed, the pleasant mask slipping to reveal something colder underneath. That recording is inadmissible, he said. Oregon is a two-party consent state. You can't record someone without their knowledge. You're right, Miranda agreed. Which is why we're not going to use it in court. We're going to upload it to the internet. Right now. Along with every file we have, every photo, every document. We're going to send it to journalists, to watchdog groups, to the FBI, to anyone who will listen. And once it's out there, you can't contain it. No matter how many cops you have on payroll, no matter how many judges you've bought, you can't unring that bell. She held up the phone, finger hovering over the send button. So here's our counteroffer, you let us walk out of here. You don't follow us, don't try to stop us. We go straight to the FBI, hand over everything, and tell them you'll be coming in to turn yourself in within the hour. If you do that, if you surrender peacefully and cooperate fully, we'll testify that you came forward voluntarily, which might get you a reduced sentence. Maybe you see your kids again before you're old. Maybe not. Or. Richard's voice had gone flat, dangerous. Or we send everything right now, and you spend the rest of your life in a maximum security prison, labeled as a trafficker, a murderer, and a corrupt official. Do you know what happens to people like that in federal prison? I don't think your military training will help much. For a long moment, nobody moved. Miranda could hear her own heartbeat, feel David standing close beside her, see the calculations running behind Richard's eyes. Then Richard laughed, a genuine sound, almost admiring. You're bluffing, he said. If you release that information publicly, David still goes down. All that evidence I've manufactured doesn't disappear just because you expose me. He still faces charges, still loses everything. Maybe, Miranda acknowledged. But you're still finished. And that's a trade we're willing to make. The question is, are you willing to lose everything just to take us down with you? Richard's hand moved toward his jacket, fast, instinctive. David reacted immediately, tackling Miranda to the ground behind their car as a gunshot cracked through the parking garage, deafeningly loud in the enclosed space. Miranda hit the concrete hard, the burner phone flying from her hand, skittering across the floor. David covered her body with his, and she heard another shot, felt him jerk as the bullet grazed his shoulder. David! She scrambled to check him, seeing blood blooming through his shirt, but he pushed her away. Get the phone! He shouted. The burner phone had slid under a nearby car, just visible in the shadows. Miranda crawled toward it as another shot rang out, the bullet sparking off concrete inches from her head. She grabbed the phone, her fingers fumbling with the screen, trying to find the send button while her hands shook and her ears rang from the gunfire. She heard Richard approaching, his footsteps measured, unhurried. He was saying something, but the words were muffled, distant. Miranda pressed send, watched the upload bar begin to crawl across the screen, 30%, 40%, 50%. A foot kicked the phone from her hand. Richard stood over her, the gun pointed at her face. Up close, she could see his expression clearly now, no more masks, no more pretense of civility. Just cold calculation and the kind of emptiness that comes from treating human lives as obstacles to be removed. You stupid, stupid people, Richard said quietly. Did you really think you could win? She already did, David said from behind him. Richard turned, and in that split second of distraction, Miranda grabbed his ankle and pulled with every ounce of strength she had. Richard stumbled, his shot going wide, and David was on him, wrestling for the gun. Miranda scrambled for the burner phone. The upload bar was at 95%. She grabbed it, held it close, watching the percentage tick up, 96%, 97%. The gun went off again. Miranda's head snapped up, fear flooding through her. David and Richard were on the ground, struggling, and she couldn't tell who'd been hit, couldn't see. Then David rolled away, and Richard lay still, blood pooling beneath him. David had gotten the gun, had fired in self-defense at point-blank range. 98%. 99%. 100%. Upload complete, the phone screen read. In the distance, Miranda heard sirens. Multiple vehicles, approaching fast. The gunshots had been reported, and police were responding. David crawled to her side, his shoulder bleeding, his face pale. Is it done? He asked. Did it send? Miranda nodded, unable to speak, just holding the phone like a talisman as the sirens grew louder. They'd done it. The files were out there, distributed to multiple recipients, impossible to contain. Richard had lost. But so, Miranda realized as police officers poured into the parking garage, guns drawn, shouting commands, so had they. Because regardless of what evidence they'd released, regardless of what truth would eventually emerge, the immediate reality was stark. They were standing over a dead body, David held a gun, and nothing about this scene looked good. Miranda raised her hand slowly, clearly, letting the burner phone fall to the ground. "We're unarmed," she called out. "We're surrendering. We have evidence of multiple crimes that we need to report to federal authorities. We need the FBI, not local police." But the officers were already moving in, separating her from David, zip-tying their hands, reading them their rights. Miranda caught David's eyes across the space between them and saw her own fear reflected back. They'd set the truth free. But freedom, Miranda understood now, was never guaranteed for the messengers. The interrogation room at the Portland Police Bureau was exactly like every interrogation room Miranda had seen in movies: gray walls, metal table, uncomfortable chairs, a mirror that was obviously one-way glass. She sat across from two detectives, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a younger man who kept his expression carefully neutral. They'd been at it for 3 hours. "Let's go through it again," Detective Morrison said, her voice patient but unyielding. "You followed your husband to a motel because you thought he was having an affair. Is that correct?" "Yes," Miranda said, for what felt like the 100th time. "But when I got there, I found him with Elena Voss, who was his colleague. They were documenting corporate fraud. Then she collapsed and died, and we realized she'd been poisoned. And rather than call 911 and wait for the police, you fled the scene. Because the person who'd poisoned her was still there. We could hear someone entering the room after the lights went out. But you have no proof of this mysterious poisoner. Richard Moss. He admitted it. We recorded him confessing in the parking garage." The detectives exchanged a look Miranda couldn't read. "About that recording," Morrison said. "We've listened to it. Mr. Moss never explicitly admits to poisoning anyone. He makes some vague statements that could be interpreted multiple ways. He threatened us. He said he had fabricated evidence against my husband. He tried to kill us." "Mr. Moss is dead," the younger detective, Henderson, said flatly. "He can't defend himself against your accusations. What we have is your word against a respected businessman's reputation." Miranda felt frustration boiling over. "Did you look at the files we uploaded? The bank records, the photographs, the evidence of trafficking." "We're looking into it," Morrison said. "But a mess. Chen, you have to understand how this appears. Your husband is documented as being involved in fraudulent activities. You followed him to a motel where a woman died under suspicious circumstances. You fled the scene. You then shot and killed a man in a parking garage. These are facts. It was self-defense. Richard shot at us first. According to you. But Mr. Moss's gun shows only one round fired, the shot that struck your husband's shoulder. Your husband's gun, however, fired 3 times. That doesn't look like self-defense. That looks like murder." Miranda stared at the detective, understanding dawning like ice water in her veins. Richard's contingency plan hadn't been to escape or negotiate. It had been to die in a way that made David look like a murderer, that discredited everything they tried to expose. Even in death, Richard was still manipulating the narrative. "I want a lawyer," Miranda said. "I'm not saying anything else without legal representation." The detective stood. "Smart choice," Morrison said. "Not unkindly, but not warmly either. You're going to need a good one." They left her alone in the room. Miranda dropped her head into her hands, exhaustion and despair washing over her. They'd survived Richard's attack, had released the evidence, had done everything they could, and still the system seemed poised to destroy them. Hours passed. Eventually, a public defender arrived. A harried woman named Jessica Patel who looked like she hadn't slept in days and probably hadn't. She reviewed Miranda's case with professional efficiency, then delivered the hard truth. The district attorney is considering charging you and David with second-degree murder, evidence tampering, and conspiracy. The fraud allegations against Richard Moss are being investigated, but that's a separate matter that doesn't necessarily exonerate you in his death. What about the files we sent out? The evidence of trafficking and corruption? The FBI is looking into it, but these investigations take time. Months, maybe years. In the meantime, you're looking at serious criminal charges. Jessica paused. I'm going to be honest with you, Miranda. This looks bad. Really bad. The best I can probably do is negotiate a plea deal, maybe voluntary manslaughter instead of murder, reduced sentence in exchange for cooperation with the fraud investigation. How long? Miranda asked, her voice hollow. 10 years. Maybe 8 with good behavior. 8 years. Miranda thought of her practice, her clients, the life she built. All of it is gone. And David would face even worse, given that he'd pulled the trigger. She spent that night in a holding cell, unable to sleep, replaying every decision that had led to this moment. If she hadn't followed David to the motel. If they'd gone straight to the FBI instead of gathering evidence. If they'd taken Richard's deal and disappeared. But she knew, with the clarity that comes from having no illusions left, that none of those choices would have led anywhere better. Richard would have hunted them regardless. The corruption would have continued. Elena would still be dead, unavenged. They'd done the right thing. Sometimes the right thing still led to ruin. Tuesday morning brought unexpected news. Jessica Patel arrived at the holding cell with an expression of barely contained amazement. The FBI just released a statement, she said, shoving her phone through the cell bars. Read it. Miranda read. Then read again, unable to believe what she was seeing. The files they'd uploaded, the ones documenting Richard's criminal enterprise, had triggered an emergency federal investigation. Within hours, FBI agents had raided Richard's home and offices, seizing computers and documents. They'd found additional evidence, including communications with known cartel members and trafficking organizations. They'd arrested 6 other employees at David's company, including 2 members of the local police force. And buried in Richard's personal files, they'd found something that changed everything: security footage from the motel parking lot, the real footage, showing Richard entering room 217 carrying a paper bag from the diner. Showing him leaving 10 minutes before Miranda arrived. Showing him cutting power to the motel breaker box. Richard had kept the footage as insurance, probably to blackmail anyone who might challenge him. But in death, it had become evidence of his guilt. The FBI statement continued, based on evidence recovered, it appears Mr. Moss attempted to murder witnesses to his criminal activities and was killed while attempting to murder David and Miranda Lawson. The Lawsons are being treated as witnesses rather than suspects. Charges are being dropped pending their cooperation with the ongoing investigation. Miranda sat down hard on the cell bunk, the phone shaking in her hands. We're free, she whispered. Not exactly free, Jessica cautioned. You'll need to testify, probably extensively. The trial will take years. And there are still civil matters. Elena's family might sue. But criminally, you're clear. They released her that afternoon. David was already waiting in the lobby, his shoulder bandaged, his face gray with exhaustion but his eyes bright with relief. When he saw her, he crossed the space between them in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms. We did it, he breathed into her hair. Elena, we finished what she started. Miranda held him, feeling the solid reality of him, alive and free and here. Yeah, she said. We did. But as they walked out of the police bureau into pale spring sunlight, Miranda felt the weight of what they'd lost. A woman was dead. Their lives would never return to normal, even vindicated, they'd always be the couple who'd taken down a criminal empire, who'd killed a man, who'd lived through a nightmare. That kind of trauma didn't just disappear. The reporters were already gathering on the steps, cameras and microphones creating a wall of documentation. Miranda took David's hand, squeezed it tight. "Ready?" she asked. "Together," he answered. And they walked forward into their uncertain future, step by careful step. 3 months later, Miranda sat in her therapy office, watching rain streak down the windows. She'd returned to work 2 weeks ago, though her practice looked different now. Some clients had left, uncomfortable with her notoriety. Others had come specifically because of it. People dealing with trauma who wanted a therapist who'd lived through her own. The trial was ongoing. David testified twice a week, walking federal prosecutors through the intricacies of Richard's operation. 16 people had been arrested so far, including the 2 corrupt police officers, Richard's assistant who'd helped coordinate the trafficking logistics, and several port officials. The DA estimated the full investigation would take another year at minimum. Elena's family had invited Miranda and David to a memorial service. Her fiancé, the man Richard had threatened to expose Elena to, spoke about her courage, her determination to do what was right even when it cost her everything. Miranda had stood beside Elena's grave, staring at the headstone that read, Elena Sofia Voss, 1992 to 2024, Truth Seeker, and felt the weight of unfinished grief. They'd saved others by stopping Richard. But they hadn't saved Elena. Miranda had spent the past months working with her own therapist, processing the trauma of that night. She still woke sometimes at 3 a.m., heart pounding, reliving the moment she'd watched Elena die or felt Richard's gun pointed at her face. David had nightmares where he pulled the trigger endlessly, each time seeing Richard's face but feeling the weight of having taken a human life. "We did what we had to do," he'd said one night, staring at the ceiling while Miranda held him. "I know that. I believe that. So why do I still feel like I murdered someone?" "Because you did," Miranda had answered gently. "In self-defense, to save our lives, but you still took a life. That's not something you get over. It's something you learn to carry." The Stoic philosophers had written extensively about duty, about doing what was necessary regardless of personal cost. Marcus Aurelius had commanded armies, had ordered deaths, and had made impossible choices. He wrote, "*The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. *" Miranda understood that now in a way she never could have before. Richard had been the impediment, and confronting him, surviving him, exposing him had forced her and David to become people they'd never imagined being. Harder people. More aware of the world's cruelty. But also more certain of their own values. Her phone buzzed. A text from David, *, testimony done for the day. "Dinner at home? I'll cook, *. She smiled, typing back, "I'll bring wine." Their marriage had been tested in ways that destroyed most relationships. But somehow, paradoxically, they'd emerged stronger. There were no more secrets between them. No more wondering if the other person was hiding something crucial. They'd seen each other at absolute worst, terrified, desperate, making split-second decisions that would haunt them forever, and they'd chosen to stay. That counted for something. As Miranda packed up her office for the day, she thought about the title someone had given their story, the headline that had run in every major news outlet. She followed him to a motel out of curiosity. What she walked into cost her life. Except it hadn't cost Miranda her life. It had cost Elena hers. And in a different way, it had cost Richard his. Though he'd been dead in all the ways that mattered long before the bullet found him, killed by his own greed and willingness to treat human beings as commodities. What Miranda had lost was innocence. The comfortable assumption that justice would naturally prevail, that good people were rewarded and bad people punished. She'd learned that sometimes justice required blood and trauma and sacrifice. That sometimes doing the right thing meant accepting you'd be changed irrevocably by the doing of it. But she'd also gained something, the knowledge that she could survive. That when tested absolutely, she hadn't broken. She'd bent, had come close to shattering, but ultimately, she'd held. That was worth remembering on the hard days. As she drove home through Portland's rain-washed streets, Miranda thought about the question her clients always asked: how do you move forward after trauma? The answer, she'd learned, wasn't about healing in the sense of returning to who you'd been before. That person was gone. The answer was about integration, taking the broken pieces and building something new, something that honored both who you'd been and who you'd become. She and David weren't the people who'd met in college, who'd married in the Japanese garden, who'd planned comfortable suburban lives. Those people had died in room 217 of the Riverside Motor Lodge, had died in the parking garage, had died 1,000 small deaths over 3 months of testimony and investigation. But the people they'd become? Those people knew what they were capable of. Knew what they were willing to sacrifice for truth. Knew that love wasn't just about comfort and consistency, it was about standing together when everything was falling apart. Miranda pulled into their driveway, saw David in the window, saw him smile when he spotted her car. She smiled back, grabbing her briefcase, locking the car, walking toward their home and whatever future they'd build from the wreckage of the past. She was different now. Scarred. Wiser. More aware of both human cruelty and human resilience. But she was alive. And sometimes, after everything, being alive was enough. What would you have done in Miranda's position? When she stood outside that motel room door, knowing something was wrong but not yet knowing how wrong, would you have walked away? Confronted the truth? Chosen comfortable ignorance over dangerous knowledge? And when the choice came down to running or fighting, surviving or seeking justice, which path would you have taken? These questions don't have easy answers. None of us knows what we're capable of until we're tested. None of us can predict how we'll respond when our comfortable lives shatter and we're forced to choose between safety and principle. Miranda and David made their choice. They survived, but not unchanged. They won, but at a cost that will follow them for the rest of their lives. Was it worth it? Ask Elena's family. Ask the trafficking victims whose suffering ended when Richard's network collapsed. Ask the people who'd been quietly crushed under his operation for years. Or maybe the better question isn't whether it was worth it, but whether there was any other choice they could have lived with. Sometimes the cost of your life isn't death, it's becoming someone you never wanted to be. And sometimes, survival means accepting that transformation, carrying its weight, and moving forward anyway. What do you think? Share your thoughts in the comments. Would you have followed him? Would you have fought? Would you have run? And if you've lived through your own impossible choice, survived your own version of that motel room moment, know that you're not alone. Know that transformation, however painful, is proof of your resilience. If this story resonated with you, hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more stories about ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances and discovering who they really are. Because in the end, that's what all these stories are about. The moment we're forced to choose who we'll become. What will you choose?